Hey there, it is Friday, and I am so thankful that you're joining me today. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I am the owner and founder of Reactive Therapy and Wellness here in the Los Angeles area. And every week, coming to share with you some of what we're learning and doing here at Reactive and bringing it to the larger world for other healthcare professionals, therapists, for people with neurologic disorders as well. And today we're talking about dystonia. Dystonia is a movement disorder, and it's actually the third most common movement disorder in the world. And it is something that we see a lot of at Reactive because we have a movement disorder fellowship. So that's actually how these videos started. Is we have a fellowship program to train physical therapists in the field of movement disorders, and dystonia being a big one of those, functional movement disorders being a big one, Parkinson's. So this is a big part of our practice. It's a big part of what we learn and we teach because we're training fellows in this field. And that's called the Schmidt Movement Disorder Fellowship, by the way. And dystonia is one of those that really takes very special understanding. And one of the first courses that we ever created was for physical therapists on dystonia. And ever since then, we have been learning and teaching and growing more to help people with dystonia really get the recovery, get back to life that we know is possible. So today I want to just do a little update. I've talked about dystonia before, but I wanted to do just a little update, talk about what is dystonia if you're not familiar with it, the different types. What are just a couple of pieces in the latest research. There's been a couple of systematic reviews that have come out, and introduce our dystonia pie chart. I think you've heard us talk about pie charts before. It's something we really love, and what goes into our understanding of dystonia and in a pie chart form. So let's talk first, what is dystonia? And I told you it's a common movement disorder. Well, it's not that common, actually. It's a third most common movement disorder. Parkinson's being the most common. Now, what's interesting is we can often see dystonia with Parkinson's, and it can be a medication effect, for example. So that's something that we look for and screen for as well. But it's a movement disorder that is characterized by involuntary muscle contractions that are associated with abnormal movements or postures. They're usually in a torsional way. So for example, it might be in the cervical spine. So you'll see a cervical dystonia, which might be a turning or tilting or movement of the head that is abnormal. And then we see it, we see a lot of people in a task specific dystonia. So these are musicians, writers, painters, that get it from task repetition. And this is something that also can be reversed, which is the good news. And this is why I really advocate for people to get the type of therapy that they need to reverse it. Now, one of my biggest pieces of advice regarding just the diagnosis of dystonia is this is not something that you kind of self-diagnose. This is not something that a physical therapist diagnoses. This is something you need to see a movement disorder specialist, and you should see somebody who knows dystonia. So in the world of neurology, in neurologists, so one, you could see a neurologist, but I would advocate you should see somebody who is fellowship trained in movement disorders and understands dystonia. Because my experience is that those people know all of the tests that they can do to screen for the causes of dystonia. And they're also really, really phenomenal at the medical management, including using Botox. So one of the medical treatments for dystonia is using Botox in overactive muscles, and it can be very effective, particularly in cervical dystonia. So I love working with a movement disorder specialist to do physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychology with the medical management and in line with it. And that's when I see people get the best outcome. So that's what is dystonia and even who manages it, who's involved. And we'll have to save this for another time, but my particular interest in dystonia is really kind of that one of curiosity of like what's really going on here? What's causing it? What's happening in the brain? And just to give you a brief background, because this relates to our pie chart, is our understanding of dystonia based on what we can see circuitry wise based on imaging studies, but also hypothesized theoretically, is that dystonia is neuroplasticity gone awry. So neuroplasticity being that our brain's natural ability to learn and make changes, and that goes awry to almost overlearn a particular posture or position. And what we can see in the studies looking at this is that there is an impairment in some of those connections in the brain, particularly in the sensory motor system. And so if this sounds familiar to you, there is an overlap with some of the functional movement disorders, because we know also that in those there is a connection problem. And that's what we see. So in dystonia, if you do an MRI, you don't see a lesion in the basal ganglia. You don't see a loss of dopamine like you might see in a DAT scan for somebody with Parkinson's. But those functional MRI and transmagnetic stimulation studies show that there is some problems in connection, and particularly in sensory and motor areas. That gives us a lot of information for treatment, right? Because then we can go and understand that we want to assess and treat from the sensory and motor levels for sure, at a minimum. And when I talk about the pie, we'll talk about all of the other categories as well. So I want to hit on a couple of pieces, and one is the systematic review in focal dystonia. It's actually, there's a free full text of it, which is great, and it just came out this year, and it was looking at the studies that have been published in the last 12 years on focal dystonia. So it's always nice to have a systematic review to kind of bring that all together. And I'll put a link. So if you're part of our newsletter that comes out every week for healthcare professionals, it actually comes out on Friday. It includes all the videos that I do, and it includes links to these articles. So I'm pulling up that article here, and it's a systematic review. It's in a European journal looking at all of the literature in focal dystonia meaning of the hand and foot. What we typically see in focal dystonia is musicians dystonia and runner's dystonia. And in this systematic review, they looked at 21 studies, and it's not surprising what they found. And this is what I talk about whenever I teach on dystonia. The studies are small, and that's what they found as well. Often like a pre-post test, not a large randomized controlled trial, blinded, all of those things. So what we know from the literature is small. We do know that people can get better, even in these small studies. And I go back to one of my favorite studies of all time, which is from 2008. So it's quite a while ago. And this was by Nancy Beal and her colleagues looking at focal dystonia, focal hand dystonia, and really having great outcomes, people returning to playing their instruments, people returning to work with their dystonia program, which is based on, as I mentioned, these concepts of learning, motor learning, and the motor and sensory feedback loops. And really retraining to get back through a graded exposure standpoint to get back to the instrument or the task that the person did. That was actually included in the systematic review. So what I did like about this systematic review is, though they said the studies are small, they're promising, and they lumped them together into these, there's different kind of categories of types of studies that people looked at, and they were movement practice, so practicing different movements, training with constraint, so meaning can you do a task under different constraints, sensory reorganization, so addressing the sensory deficits, biofeedback training, this is something we use a lot with surface EMG, neuromodulation training, so particularly looking at the whole of the nervous system. And what we understand in dystonia is that there's increased excitatory and less inhibitory input. So can we modulate that? And that's something, again, that we put in our pie chart. And then compensatory strategies. So can you get around to your activities with the dystonia not interfering? So those are the types of studies that were included in the systematic review. So let's put this into the pie chart then. So we talked a little bit about what is dystonia. We talked a little bit about the understanding, just very briefly in the pathophysiology, a little bit about the evidence. And now what does that mean for us as therapists, and how can we approach this? Now, quite a few years ago, I actually put this into a blog post and made a downloadable handout that has a dystonia evaluation cheat sheet and a dystonia treatment cheat sheet. I'm going to be updating those blog posts to add our new evaluation and treatment cheat sheet. So stay on the lookout for those. Those blog posts are on our website, reactivept.com, and you can click blog and take a look at those, but they include some downloads. So if you're new to dystonia, you can see our cheat sheets there. And on our new cheat sheets, we have a pie chart. And so you got to imagine the pie, right? Broken into different pieces. You can imagine there's a motor control piece for sure, a sensory piece for sure, and lots of other pieces that can contribute. So those would include the autonomic nervous system. This is why people have studied neuromodulation as a treatment. It includes actual physical impairment. So we often find that there are maybe some flexibility issues, strength issues, nerve tension is a big one that might be triggering or contributing to the symptoms. Lifestyle pieces, so sleep, fitness levels, healthy diet, things like that definitely can contribute to the symptoms, and addressing those have been a part of the successful trials. And then finally, psychosocial as well. And there are some really interesting studies that have come out recently looking at the impact of the person's personality, the impact of their emotional health on the dystonia. And not surprising, it has a big impact. I think we see that in all neurologic disorders. So so when we go in for therapy, we assess all of those different areas. And then based on what we find in assessment, we start our treatment right there at the biggest piece of the pie. Maybe it's autonomic, maybe it's sensory, maybe it's motor control, maybe it's actually lifestyle. Sleep deprivation has been a huge trigger for dystonia for people, so maybe it's actually addressing the sleep issue. So what I like about the pie, it helps us individualize to the person. Let's understand where they are, and let's make a very specific treatment approach and bring the whole team on board if that's needed as well. And that it can change. Maybe as the autonomic pieces of the pie get better, that gives us the opportunity to work on the sensory motor piece more, for example. So there you have it. We talked what is dystonia today, a little bit of that pathophysiology, some of the latest in the research, particularly a systematic review. And how do we put all those pieces together to help the person in front of us with the pie chart? So I'll put all of these resources, including our blog posts, including the links to the article. I will put all of these in our newsletter. It goes out today. If you're not already on our newsletter as a healthcare provider, you can sign up on our webpage at reactiveeducation.com. You can also sign up if you are a person with dystonia and interested. You can sign up on our webpage at reactivept.com. And I just want to thank you so much for being a really, truly wonderful community to be with and learn with. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you.